Greetings and salutations, friends, and welcome back to Beasts of the Old World, where today we're talking about giants. Every fantasy setting has to have giants. Big, dumb, bumbly things that wander the Warhammer world, molesting animals and breaking wind. Yet it was not always so, because the giants of Warhammer have a pretty cool little backstory, which you shouldn't look too deeply into, but nevertheless, it's a pretty damn cool idea. For the massive, violent, and thoroughly stupid giants of modern-day Warhammer are a far cry from their noble and highly intelligent ancestors. What these giants of myths called themselves, we do not know. All we know is what the people who ate them called them. And no, that is not a metaphor. The Sky Titans, you see, lived amongst the highest peaks of the Mountains of Morn. There, the Sky Titans created their fortresses, their homes, their castles, and their vast herd enclosures, thousands and thousands of years before the rise of the man-god Sigmar. And they lived, as far as we can tell, mostly isolated, peaceful lives. Small groups of giants scattered across dozens of fortresses, as they were not particularly fond of company. Undoubtedly, they would have been small familial groups, perhaps even clans in some way or another, but they never unified into any sort of a nation, nor did the various peaks and fortresses ever seemingly ally with one another or form any sort of a confederacy. This was much to their detriment. As some 2,700 years before Sigmar, an enormous comet fell screaming out of the sky and blasted a tremendous hole to the east of the Mountains of Morn. This was the god of the ogres, the Great Maw, whose arrival wiped out a monstrous chunk of the ogre species. And that was just the hors d'oeuvres, as the Great Maw soon began spewing forth clouds of corruption and warpstone dust, killing off whatever wildlife and flora that had somehow survived the impact, leaving the land around the Great Maw for miles and miles as a desolate, dead wasteland, and driving what remained of the ogre population to the brink of starvation. Luckily, the ogre's neighbors had tended vast herds of mammoths for hundreds of years. Food enough to feed the entirety of ogredom for a seeming eternity. And whilst previously the presence of the Sky Titans themselves had proved adequate deterrent, that was before the ogre's only options were the Sky Titans and lots of fluffy mammoth meat, or an enormous toothed hole in the ground that just devoured half of their species. The Sky Titans were in for quite the vigorous migration, as the ogres quickly overran the outer-lying smaller Sky Titan fortresses, slaughtering entire herds of mammoths and devouring them raw right there on the field. And when the herdsmen themselves sallied forth to figure out what was wrong with their herds, they too swiftly disappeared down the invaders' gullets. As news spread, the remaining Sky Titans closed and barred their massive gates. They holed up in their fortresses alongside with as much of their herd and family as they could, hoping that the ogres might now, after having been fully satisfied, turn back around again. But this was no mere raid, nor was it a war of conquest with limited objectives. The Great Maul's influence and contamination grew more powerful each and every day, driving the ogres further and further westwards, deeper and deeper into Sky Titan territory. Everything was not lost yet, however. The ogres had had a literal chunk taken out of them with the arrival of their new deity. If the Sky Titans had unified, had marched out against the ogres, or even simply come to one another's defense when needed, there is every possibility they could have held out against the invader. But centuries, if not millennia, of isolation is not something changed overnight, and the Sky Titans remained isolated. Each holdout remained its own little fortress. Each clan, each family defended itself and only itself. Until by the time they began to realize the gravity of the threat facing them, literal extermination at the mouths of ogres, it was all too late. With their last few major bastions already under siege, desperately defending themselves with monstrous cyclopean cannons that had been crafted specifically to counter the ogres. And whilst I am sure that cannonballs the size of houses would have cut terrible grooves of blood and spilled the guts through ogre lines, it was all too little, all too late. And the last few solid holdouts of the Sky Titans were soon reduced to rubble, and their inhabitants to dinner by the aggressive and ever more desperate hordes. Some of the Sky Titans did manage to escape, as many must have realized that it was time to flee whilst the ogres were busy with their banquet. It is from these refugees that the giants of today hail, as the Sky Titans themselves, as far as we know, have been completely wiped out. Though we are also not entirely certain whether a Sky Titan is truly the same as a giant, or if the giants are some sort of lesser variant of Sky Titan. One of the main differences, for example, was that the Sky Titans seemingly never stopped growing, and the ogres even have a legend suggesting that some of the oldest amongst them were not killed at all. Instead, they simply turned into mountains in their own rights. Whereas the modern giants of the Warhammer world, they're big, 6, 7 or 8 meters, up to, 18, 20 feet? Chunky to be sure, but they're no mountains. And in all due likelihood, the size differential between modern-day giants and the Sky Titans was very, very, very pronounced, as we know that the last Sky Titan, presumably, was hunted down, killed, and eaten by the ogres some 1,700, 600 years before the rise of Sigmar, and this single carcass fed an entire tribe of ogres for months. That is a ridiculous quantity of meat. Far more than on any modern giant. There are many possible explanations for this obvious divergence in size. Maybe the modern-day giants are an entirely different race compared to the original Sky Titans. Maybe they are a natural evolution or devolution based on the fact that they are no longer in a safe environment with plenty of resources and food. Maybe it is simply them adopting to a far more hostile world. A form better suited to avoiding ogres, mayhaps, though even then that is not always successful, as the ogres still take a great deal of pride in hunting down and enslaving giants. But Interestingly, the giants also seem to have some sort of almost natural racial memory of their time as Sky Titans. The more eloquent, intelligent, and well-established giants, for example, have on several occasions told their stories to those interested, to scholars or simply their mercenary captains or comrades. It has been used as an explanation for why they drink so much, so often, and in such gigantic quantities. And fair enough, if your species used to be one that sat on mountainous thrones atop clouds, and now you're struggling to even feed yourself day to day whilst the lesser races nip at your heels, I can see the need for alcohol. Though, again, how exactly this story is being told from generation to generation to generation to generation is in and of itself a bit of an unanswered mystery. I'm presuming that there are giant females, and I am presuming that giants have giant babies, despite the fact that giants again seem to be always loners, hermites, sedentary. They don't seem to even exist in familial units anymore, so maybe they spring forth from each other's loins. Maybe there's only one gender of giant. Maybe there's a spawning yard somewhere where they all come to get together once a year or something, God only knows. But giant procreation is not really the main point here. Rather, how is the knowledge transferred? Giants have no sort of codified writing that we know of, like they have an internet or a library where they can look this up, and if they're not being raised in a familial unit, who's telling them these stories of long-gone glories? Just random other giants? Why would the giants even hang out and speak in the first place, since they seem to avoid one another frequently? For realistic reasons as well, this is probably one of the rationales for why the giants were so incredibly isolated to begin with. If you're the size of a mountaintop and your herd consists of mammoths, odds are you're quite the strain on the local environment. Energy-wise, you're going to be eating a lot of things. And so having 2 or 3 or 4 or more giants in the same area, you'd very quickly hit the kind of level where you literally can't feed everyone. This would be a lesser concern for modern giants, but make no mistake, even then, a single giant can eat the equivalent of half a dozen or so cows before being like, yep, I'm full, can't eat another bite. It's still quite the hefty strain on the local livestock. No mistakes made there. So again, how exactly this tradition, this story is being passed down is a mystery, and probably one more from the convenience of the writers rather than a truly well thought out storyline, but oh well, details. Speaking of details, it's time to move on from the giants' ancient and tragic past to the modern day giants. How do they exist now that their empire is nothing more than dust and barely remembered memories? How do the giants exist? Well, rather interestingly, for such a loner-like species, most of the modern-day giants tend to exist in some form of symbiosis with the more civilized races, though civilized is a very relative term, as one of the species that the giants tend to have the closest bond with are the greenskins. Of all bunches. I mean, it makes a certain amount of sense. Giants are very large, very violent, and very stupid. Orcs want to be very large, very violent, and very stupid. The giants are de facto the idols of the greenskin world, and indeed, there are many stories of giants being literally worshipped as avatars of Gork and Mork by greenskin tribes. Now, of course, they don't mistake them for their actual gods, but they do view them as symbols of them, as prophets or walking shrines, essentially. Something that suits the giants just perfectly, as the greenskins will not only bring them along and make sure that they're well fed and taken care of with plentiful offerings of alcoholic beverages, cows, animals, prisoners of war, whatever they come across, but they also bring them from one battle to the other. And giants are quite fond of fighting. Though the giants themselves probably wouldn't classify it as fighting in the way that we would view it. They'd probably see it more as a rambunctious play with fatal consequences. Think about it like this. If a fly sneaks into your room and you crush it with a fly swatter, would you consider that to have been a fight? No. Nor do the giants consider killing humans to be fighting. This can also be seen in their erratic behavior when they're actually engaged. They can one moment be swinging away at an entire formation with a literal tree trunk, killing half a dozen men with every swipe. Then they'll stop doing the useful thing and start picking up and torching one enemy warrior at a time, or putting them into a container for safekeeping for later snacking, etc. They don't really fight to win because they're not entirely aware that they're in a fight, both because they're so much larger than the opposition that they don't really see it as fighting, and because they are shit-faced drunk half the time. But of course, not all giants can live the good life alongside orcs and goblins. In fact, a fair few do exist within the borders of the more or less civilized nations like the Empire or Bretonia or the Border Princes. Again, most of the time, they will try to integrate to some extent with local society, because, well, here's the thing. A giant can cause a lot of problems wherever he is. If a giant wants to eat your cow, the giant will eat your cow, and there is a fat load of nothing you can do about it. But giants that do that tend to be very loud giants, very noisy giants that draw a lot of attention to themselves, and in turn draw a lot of heavily armed militias to their locations. A giant that earns the ire of the local state forces tends to not remain a living giant for particularly long, because, well, they're not necessarily particularly good at fighting. And when up against disciplined ranks of crossbowmen, or gunners, or pistoliers, or a knightly order, things go south for them quite quickly. It's not to say that feral giants are impossible, or even all that uncommon. It's simply that they will tend to pick areas of these civilized lands that are more remote, more isolated, and there are plenty such spots within the Empire. Vast forests filled with beastmen that tend to leave the giants alone as well, giants are not exactly a civilizing factor in any area, and the beastmen do like things that are big, ugly, dumb, and chaotic as well. The giant can live off the land, hunting, sort of, anyways, if it can catch animals, or it could raid local villages. So long as it keeps moving, it can hit one community one day and then be miles and miles and miles away the other. A roving giant that understands that it is smart to stay on the move can be virtually impossible to pin down. And the moment he crosses the magic state line between one elect account responsibility and the next, he's home free. Of course, this does require a certain amount of intelligence and or soberness, so far from all giants will abide by this maxim. Indeed, in many cases, a giant will stay in an area until he has hunted it to de facto depletion, where everyone has moved away, and then he will move on to the next area, for no other reason than because he's hungry now. Meanwhile, the more cooperative giants can actually live quite steady lives, consistent and fulfilled lives, so long as they are able and willing to offer up their services. For example, the giant ass cannon found in Talabheim is served by a giant that reloads the weapon. Other giants can become mercenaries, where they fulfill much the same role as with the orcs and goblins, but with better pay. And there are plentiful mercenary companies all too happy to hire giants, because, again, quite cheap. They physically can't handle money because of the size of their fingers, and food and alcohol are, well, readily available on any victorious battlefield, especially if some civilian structures can be liberated afterwards. It gives the giant a constant stream of food, of plunder, of loot, of alcohol, and comrades with which to fight alongside for however long he wishes. Alternatively, they can also take up permanent refuge within cities. Now, this depends a bit more on how tolerant the locals are, but there are tales of giants becoming, well, quite beloved, really, when they take on certain tasks. For example, the raising or lowering of a bridge, or the opening or closing of a particularly titanic gate made out of solid metal that required a dozen men, but just one giant. Obviously, coexistence has its fair share of drama as well, as the giants at absolute best will view the humans as a convenience that provides it with food and beverage, and as annoying insects at worst. And the humans, well, it is damnable difficult to ever get truly comfortable with a monster wandering through the streets of your city that could theoretically pick you up and eat you at any moment, or simply just squash you dead beneath its feet in a moment of carelessness. Not even malice, just an accident. And almost inevitably, over time, most giants will have some sort of falling out with their local communities because, again, complications. Though there are examples of giants operating alongside humans in a more fleshed out social system, structure, style of thingity-bob, question mark. Though this example that I'm thinking of here is canonically dubious, shall we say, as I am referring to the Giants of Albion. Now, those of you who have been around in Warhammer for quite some time know of Albion as a very, very, very retarded little island with very, very, very retarded lore. This was back in the day when GW was like, yeah, we're basically ripping off history. So what? And it produced some very stupid things. In the case of Albion, which was obviously the British Isles, basically, but with giants and druids, well, I'm not even going to paint you a picture. All I'm going to tell you is that the British Isles in Warhammer Fantasy was invaded by the Regiments. Yes, the Regiments. Under the command of Curious Gazer. Oh, God damn it. But anywho, Albion had a class of druids. Because of course it did. And these druids could speak to the giants. Almost all of the giants anyways. The biggest of all the giants was too stupid to be able to communicate with them, but the rest of the giants could actually speak to the druids, or more correctly, the druids could speak to them. And they could even, to some extent, control them, though it is unclear whether the druids outright controlled the giants, as in some sort of physical or mental control or a command system, or whether or not the two simply existed in harmony and unison. What we do know is that the druids would order the giants around to build ritual cairns or circles with which they could study the stars and other such bollocks, and in return, in all due likelihood, the druids kept the giants well fed. The giants also were not entirely tame, mind you, as they would attack anyone and everyone that approached Albion, whether they were supposed to or not, and they would also occasionally attack each other and the druids as well, as was the case of the dumbest of all the giants, their king, and also a bit of a deity on the island, who would simply just kill, eat, crush, destroy whatever he came across, 'cause, well, funny. Nevertheless, it does prove, at least to an extent, that giants are able to coexist alongside humans. Another example of this can be found in the cold, dark north, where quite a few giants venture. In fact, a lot of them go up there. Now again, the precise reason as to why is unclear. Giants do not appear to be particularly susceptible to the influence of chaos. They do not appear to be chaotic creatures in any way, shape, or form, though they do absolutely mutate, more or less along the lines of humans, in fact. So they are absolutely susceptible to chaos mutations. They are not particularly resistant to its lure, but nor are they, again, naturally inclined towards chaos, it seems. There was an interesting mention of this in the Old World Bestiary that I remember, where one giant explained that they drink because of the memories of their lost homeland, of the glory that once was theirs, or many of them surrender themselves to the darkness of the far north, as both are a way to forget about the glories that they have now lost, which I thought was very interesting, because that absolutely makes sense. Chaos is an overriding thing. It takes complete control of a creature and overrides everything else. Every other priority becomes secondary to pleasing the chaos gods. If you truly wanted to forget anything and everything for eternity, well, service to the laughing gods would absolutely be a way to do so. It also probably doesn't hurt that the northern tribes are also constantly at war with one another in one shape, form, or another, therefore constantly in need of giant powerful mercenaries to help them out. I imagine food is probably scarcer far north, but ale is probably plentiful, as that is a natural part of knockoff Viking society. Furthermore, the bigotry of the civilized people, their anti-giant racism, unfounded as it is, holds far less sway in the frozen north. The Norskins tends to be quite accepting of unnatural, monstrous things, not just chaotic in nature, but, things like dragon ogres or trolls, or indeed giants as well, are simply seen as other mysterious creatures. They are not viewed as inherently or moralistically evil like they are in the Imperium. In fact, this is also up to a great deal of the propaganda, quote-unquote, the common perception of these things. The Empire, for example, I probably called them the Imperium a few times already. In the Empire, the unnatural is shunned. It is unclean, it is heretical, it is corrupting. And, well, these beliefs are held for good reasons, because that is chaos in a nutshell. And anything that is not human tends to be very violent, angry, and exceedingly dangerous, like the Beastmen, for example, like trolls, or hippogriffs, or mutant bandits, or marauding warpants, etc. The populace of the Empire have very very good reason to be mightily distrustful of anything not themselves. Whereas in the north, again, alliances between Norscan tribes and giants and monsters and warbands, etc., are all quite normal. In fact, in many cases, even though they might not understand exactly what a thing is, a manticore, for example, the Norskins won't understand what a manticore is in terms of it being an animal or a chaotic creature. They will simply view it as a personification of the powers that they worship, and perhaps as a herald of those powers. As such, they will feed it, they will comfort it, they will act nice around it, and give it offerings. In return, the best case scenario, the angry, violent monster thing might go, "Ooh, happy little humans, they feed me. I shall refrain from eating them, because, I'm not hungry, really." Now, you could certainly argue that this essentially means that an entire village has been enslaved by an enormous mutated pussycat. But it's a better fate than being eaten alive, now isn't it? And thus, giants as well find ready and happy homes in the north, free of bigotry and anti-giant racism. Plus, we should probably also remember as well that the longer and the further north the giants stray and stay, the more likely they are to remain as well, as chaos really starts getting its clutches into them real good and deep. And obviously, a trained, motivated giant armed with chaos weaponry will be quite the asset to any chaos warband. And on that slightly disturbing note, I will wrap up this video on the giants. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching, and I hope to see you all again soon. Till then, have a good day.